Conversations on race and policing began in response to the police killing of George Floyd on May 25, 2020. In this partnership between CSU San Bernardino and the Brennan Center for Justice, we hope to engage in ongoing discussions related to the history and current context of race, policing, and criminal justice with guests from diverse academic fields and backgrounds.
The China Initiative, and I'm going to pass it to Matt Padino for the land acknowledgement.
Thank you. California State University San Bernardino acknowledges that the land on which our San Bernardino facility is sited is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mariam, commonly referred to as the Serrano people, which in the contemporary era are represented by two federally recognized Indian tribes, the Yuhaviatam of San Manuel Nation and the Morongo Band of Mission Indians. Our histories and stories are intertwined in this space, and by sharing them in culturally appropriate ways, we honor and celebrate our indigenous neighbors and partners. Since 1965, CSUSB's development has benefited and will continue to benefit from this land's location and resources, and we recognize this. Along with this land acknowledgement, this university affirms tribal sovereignty and our responsibility to work with these tribes to further mutual respect and gratitude for all those involved. And now I will turn it over to my colleague, Mike German.
Actually, to Jeremy, I think.
I'll jump in and then, sorry, Matt and Mike, I'll jump in and give a quick introduction of our guests. Mike is usually one of our organizers, so he's going to be a featured guest along with Gisela today. Our guests are today Gisela Perez Kusakawa. She's been executive director of the Asian American Scholars Forum since 2022. This is her second time joining our series, Conversations on Race and Policing. Kusakawa is a civil rights leader, policy expert, and attorney with a proven record in advocacy and under multiple presidential administrations. Prior to accepting her leadership role at the AASF, Kusakawa served as the founding director and supervising attorney of the Anti-Profiling, Civil Rights, and National Security Program, formerly the Anti-Racial Profiling Project, at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, one of the largest and leading national Asian American civil rights organizations in the country. She was the primary and lead drafter and legal strategist for amicus briefs for Professors Xiaoxing Xi and Feng Tao. She has been a trailblazer and an expert on policy and advocacy on anti-profiling, national security, and civil rights, having spearheaded coalition work to end the U.S. Department of Justice's China Initiative, which is today's subject. She has appeared in multiple media outlets such as NBC News, Science, LA Times, NPR, and the MIT Technology Review. Her community involvement includes serving on the board of directors for the Asian Pacific American Bar Association Education Fund, the conferences on Asian Pacific American leadership, the National Filipino American Lawyers Association, and is a founder and president-elect of the Filipino American Lawyers Association of DC. For her work in civil rights and public service, Kusakawa had the honor of receiving the Justice Thurgood Marshall Civil Liberties Award and was awarded the competitive National Asian Pacific American Bar Association Law Foundation Community Law Fellowship, which seeks to develop public interest law leaders to advance Asian American civil rights. Kusakawa is a first-generation immigrant who hails from the Philippines and spent her childhood in Tondo, Manila, before moving to the United States. And she received her JD from the George Washington University Law School. Also joining us as guest today is Mike German. Mike has been part of the organizing team here in the Conversations on Race and Policing for over 4 years. We roped him in after he joined us as a guest to talk about the differences between January 6th and Black Lives Matter police responses. He's also been a featured guest for his many trenchant books and articles on topics of race and policing, especially intersections of white supremacy and policing. He was a fellow with the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. He's worked at the ACLU and served 16 years as an FBI special agent. He's the author of Thinking Like a Terrorist, as well as Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide, How the New FBI Damages Our Democracy, and most recently, Policing White Supremacy from the New Press. His work has also included analysis of the China Initiative, and he has published several articles analyzing its impacts. German's work, Thinking Like a Terrorist, based on his experience undercover with white supremacist gangs, was also the basis of the 2016 film Imperium, starring Daniel Radcliffe and Toni Collette. Entertainment Weekly said it was a tense, chilling thriller, and the LA Times called it impressively dimensional, tense, gripping, and disturbing. I recommend everybody get the books and look for the advocacy and the articles written by Gisela and Mike in the news. I'll share links to their profiles, and you can learn more about both of them. And now I'll toss the floor over to Mike and Gisela. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Jeremy. I had the pleasure of working closely with Gisela in end of 2019 and 2020 when the China Initiative started, and found, not just she's an excellent lawyer as her bio reveals, but also an excellent organizer. And she did a lot of the organizing and a lot of the hard work to produce a series of webinars we did with it while she was at the Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, with a group called APA Justice Task Force. And we have links to those webinars. And I think those webinars were really essential to raising awareness, particularly among journalists, about the unfairness of the China Initiative. But Gisela, why don't we start just by giving a brief overview of what the China Initiative was.
No, absolutely, Mike. And it's always an honor to be able to sit in conversation with Mike. Many don't know, but he's an untold hero when we talk about the end of the China Initiative, because it really took a coalition, including people previously in law enforcement, to convince people that this was really not the right approach. I think for many folks here, when we're trying to understand, well, what exactly was the China Initiative? It was a program under the Department of Justice, under the first Trump administration. It was meant to allegedly address espionage and intellectual property theft attributed to the Chinese government. However, it soon raised concerns of racial profiling and heightened scrutiny of Asian American scholars, particularly individuals of Chinese descent. And I still remember this moniker on the ground, where many Chinese American scholars would say it was essentially researching wild Chinese. It was a completely new environment in terms of how the Asian American community was going to tackle the level of resources and attention that was being put onto them. And it really incentivized us to try to figure out how do we address, law enforcement in the way that the Asian American community was experiencing it, which was largely from an intelligence lens, which is very complicated, not as transparent, and extremely challenging. So it was really that period of time that you saw sort of a McCarthy-like period for the ANHPI community.
But that wasn't the first time that Chinese scientists were targeted. And even under the Obama administration, there were a number of cases that didn't hold muster when brought to public light. Can you talk about that period and kind of the history of targeting Chinese and Asian Americans as national security threats?
No, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that we tried to emphasize to folks that, the Department of Justice China Initiative was not the start of racial profiling of Asian Americans under national security pretext. It was an escalation, but we saw beforehand, for example, in the case of Professor Xiaoxing Shi at Temple University, he had experienced accusations of being a technological spy. And that was back in May 2015 when the FBI had raided his home. He was detained, he was interrogated. allegedly for essentially a pocket heater. The government said that he had violated an agreement by sharing information about the heater with colleagues in China, and he was indicted on 4 counts of wire fraud. What we saw from this case essentially is that this use of wire fraud was going to run rampant under the China initiative. I would say wire fraud along with false statements. And you would see a very creative way that the Department of Justice would look into professors, academics, and scholars across the country based on the fact that their salaries relied on federal grant funding. And so we consider this in many ways the criminalization of normal academic activities that was happening before the China initiative. And in many ways, I would consider sort of being tested. And then they ran full blown once the China initiative was launched. But what was really important, and the reason I started the program at Advancing Justice AJC, it was the first department at my previous nonprofit that connected national security and racial profiling. We saw historically that the ways that Asian Americans were profiled could not be separated from national security issues. So back in when we think about the incarceration of Japanese Americans, many people don't even recall why Japanese Americans, both US citizens and children, were rounded up into these camps, incarceration camps. And the reason fundamentally is not far off from why many Chinese American scientists are being scrutinized right now. When we think about the incarceration of Japanese Americans, there was an argument at the time that they were going to be more prone to committing acts of espionage based on their background. It wasn't pinned based on particular activities. It was a widespread scale that painted a broad brush across a whole ethnic background. And what we're seeing right now is that continues to reiterate itself, but in a modern version. We're not seeing people round up, but we're seeing people still targeted in a wide scale in a way that there's a lack of transparency in terms of who's going to get targeted. But there is a sense on the ground from the community that if you're of Chinese background, that you need to pay a little bit more attention, that you won't be treated the same way as your other colleagues, and that you may find that you committing normal activities could somehow still lead and escalate to criminal investigations.
And that history I knew very well, and part of what drew me into that work was some of the cases that I examined in my book, Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide, that showed that racial profiling was happening, not just the FBI and the Justice Department targeting people in the Asian American community, but even internally, Asian American FBI agents were being targeted as suspected spies, even when there was no evidence to justify it. In fact, there were white males who were involved in that kind of activities rather than the agents who were falsely targeted. And one of my concerns when the Trump administration announced this program, even though this was a widespread and long-term problem of racial profiling in the national security space, was the naming of a program, the China Initiative. Because what I saw as a former FBI agent was that it moved the locus of the inspection of the investigation away from espionage or economic espionage to Chinese identity. That there was some connection there, because if you found a Russian spy, that didn't solve your problem of now having to address this initiative and have cases justifying this initiative. So first you had to find somebody who had some relationship with China, even if that was just ancestral. And then you had to prove a case of economic espionage, which, as Gisela mentioned, was the problem, that it was no longer looking at state-sponsored espionage or economic espionage that benefited the state of China, but rather any kind of intellectual property theft, which is a crime, worthy of investigation, but the focus on making sure that we had somebody with an Asian background as our subject just basically codified that racial profiling that was inherent in the national security system.
What was interesting about it, Mike, was the Asian American community had looked a lot to literature, for example, that you had done following 9/11 with AMEMSA groups, for those who don't know, Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian communities, when it came to how they were painted when it comes to counterterrorism programs, theories of radicalization, just the idea that people would be more prone to committing certain actions that threaten national security based on their religion, national origin, or ethnicity. And so I think the experiences of Japanese Americans was very helpful in us understanding this running theme. But the scholarship you have done and the work others had done with the MEMSA groups post 9/11 gave us a more modern perspective on how it might be applied to Chinese American scientists and the broader Asian American community currently.
And I think that's an excellent point. When the coalition that Gisela and I were a part of first came together and tried to strategize how we were going to address this problem that, again, had these long-standing roots, one of the things that we learned from our work with the Mensa communities was how important it was to get journalists to challenge the government viewpoint. If in the early period after 9/11, if somebody was charged with a terrorism-related offense or supporting terrorism, that became a sensationalized story, and it would often be months or years before anybody actually started challenging the evidence. And, you'd see a federal prosecution takes a long time. So it would be 2-3 years later when all of a sudden in court, the government can't make the case that it said, that it alleged. And then, those cases oftentimes, because the public animosity against them through this terrorism charge was so strong. So, a lot of our webinars were really directed to educate journalists so that they could challenge, because the espionage charge is the same, right? It's that this idea, as Gisela mentioned, that intelligence activities need to be secret. They need a thick cloak of secrecy. So when somebody's charged with espionage, we shouldn't expect the same level of scrutiny that we see in a criminal trial where somebody's charged with some bank robbery or something like that, okay, there are some things that the government should keep secret. And even as in the cases that Gisela mentioned prior to the China initiative being formalized, even though those cases were dropped, there was a lingering, it was dropped because the government didn't want to reveal their sources and methods, rather than it was dropped because these people didn't do what the government alleged. And so there's a lingering public concern about the loyalty of these individuals once they've been labeled that way. And I think that was one of the successes of the program, the webinar program we initiated, because what you started to see was great journalism and researchers. There was a Massachusetts or MIT Technology Review did an excellent analysis of China Initiative cases, and the type of research that was being done. I don't know if you can talk about some of that research and what it was showing about the impact on American U.S. science, and the fact that if you're making these kinds of allegations, obviously false ones, but even just conflating some administrative error in filing some paperwork on a federal grant as espionage, it chills scientific achievement.
No, absolutely. And I agree with you that, when it's easy to forget where reporters were before all the education efforts. But we had found that in the very beginning, when the China Initiative was launched, that many reporters would just repeat exactly what was on the website, not understanding what sort of, fear that would raise in the community, how it would isolate many of these individuals and create presumptions of guilt for themselves. And so it was really important for us to change the narrative, make sure people are actually having open dialogue, scrutinize some of these cases, and of course, start getting data out there. What was really fascinating about the MIT Technology Review was them breaking apart the different types of cases and also putting a number to what was very clear to the Asian American community because we felt it. They had found that nearly 90% of the defendants charged under the initiative are of Chinese heritage. Take that what you will, but it was impactful to our community to actually have a number and show we are being scrutinized heavily and this is impacting our communities directly. But what was very interesting from the perspective of the legal community was that many of these cases didn't actually have an obvious connection or even a small connection when it comes to national security or the theft of trade secrets, which is what the program had stated it was meant to tackle. Instead, a significant number of the cases had to do with research integrity issues, which we had felt, along with other experts, are issues that need to be tackled administratively. And also, there were issues where the community themselves were still trying to determine how they were going to handle disclosures, how the research community was going to handle risk. And so instead of pushing so many of these cases straight into the criminal justice system, we needed to figure out, how we can actually solve some of the genuine concerns within the research community without destroying people's lives. And so there's that deterrent effect that Mike was talking about, where, in law enforcement was just deterring scientists and researchers from certain activities. We needed to take a step back and ask ourselves, were they being deterred in the right way, or were we shooting ourselves in the foot and actually hurting our research enterprise and also our national security goals?
Yeah, and I think that was a big part of the problem with this movement from espionage, state spying to get national security secrets, to economic espionage, where, okay, they're trying to steal trade secrets and intellectual property that the government of whatever country, and this idea that China somehow was doing that much more than anyone else, when there's not really a lot of evidence about that. A lot of countries try to steal technology. But then the shift away from state-sponsored activities to any individual engaging in the theft of intellectual property, and then further to this academic integrity where somebody didn't fill in paperwork absolutely correctly on a federal grant, and how that movement away from what the government was actually looking at had a natural and legitimate interest in curbing had changed to where now the average academic can work on a project, and maybe there's a scholar in a foreign country that I can learn from or collaborate with in a way that will move my research further. But that brings inherent risk now, because if that researcher is from China or has a relationship with a Chinese university, the government now looks at that quite differently. And just to wrap up sort of the scope of the China initiative, in 2021 or 2022, the Biden administration ended the formal China initiative. But did the activities that concern the Asian American community and all of the scientific and research community end?
Yeah, and at the time when Assistant Attorney General Matt Olson announced the end of the China initiative, I think for the Asian American community, it was seen as a breather. a moment for a de-escalation of what the launch of the China initiative had started. We wanted to get, especially a lot of these academic integrity cases, out of the purview of the criminal justice system and figure out how can we address them more on the administrative end. And so where we hoped it would lead to at that time was that the cases that the DOJ takes on would require a higher threshold where they were not just taking any academic that, you don't have this individual that calls about a professor who's of Chinese descent in their department because they want to get the promotion instead, or a university that throws their professor under the bus because they had also, right, they applied for these grants together. We wanted to make sure that really we didn't have this escalation, and there was really a higher standard when it comes to how material is this case to the actual goals of combating espionage, and is there actually a national security connection? And if there's not, the DOJ should defer this to the federal grant agencies and to the universities. And then that would give us leeway for the community to then work with these other entities to come up with fair solutions, because we also didn't want them to be getting in trouble on the administrative end if it wasn't fair. If, for example, at the time that they had gone to a conference in China, it was actually encouraged that they go and have these engagements. And so that required a lot of time. But one of the, obviously, the challenges, even though it gave us a breather, was you can't just stop these cases. Even though they announced the end of the China initiative, all of the cases that had started under it needed to still go through the normal legal process. And so certainly that's time consuming and very challenging for people on the ground. But there was a strong message, I think, that the community received, that we were able to get this step forward, and maybe we can continue to have small wins along the way.
And I want to make sure that we open it up to our other hosts, and if anybody in the audience has a question, you can put it in the Q&A feature. But if unless somebody has a question, Jeremy, do you have to?
Thank you, Mike. I was formulating a question, so I'll try not to take too long, but as I sort of get it together, this idea of government by campaign, is very much a marker, I think, of obviously both Trump administrations. There's a lot of sort of vibes, just in terms of putting out an idea like xenophobia or sort of anti-Chinese sentiment or resentment. But again, I think, as you noted, this is not just something of the Trump administration. This is something that we saw in the previous and in the Biden interregnum there. I think it's worrying to think about the idea of sort of government by campaign, because it gets into these issues that are at the heart of what both Gisela and Mike do, and that is look at how things are prioritized. And that idea of priorities is a term that keeps coming up for me. We've done almost 150 of these events. But what is a priority? What gets priority of law enforcement resources, of oversight resources or surveillance resources? Of course, the famous Cardinal Richelieu line was something like, I think it was Richelieu, give me 50 words by the most honest man and I'll give you something to hang him by. Right? That idea of sort of everybody's innocent until they're investigated. That gets to this question of priorities, and it's very squishy and it's very hard to track, or it's hard for most people to track. But you both do such an excellent job of tracking and of showing how this issue is misguided. It's at the heart of Mike's work, and also what you're doing, Gisela, to ensure the just application of the law. But in terms of racial profiling, there's this old saw that I hear. I used to work when I was a waiter. A bunch of NYPD guys would moonlight as security guards at the place I used to work, and they would say things like, racial profiling is illegal, but it works. So there's this false kind of common sense right? It's not actually common sense, but it's a false common sense. And we get a lot of that from the Trump administration, sort of false common sense. And then it has an impact on priorities and where those priorities get directed. So I was just interested in that concept of priorities and what you thought about that, how we can track that in law enforcement, in the application of the law, in the courts. I think we heard a little bit, movements toward the answer there in terms of raising awareness. Mike was talking about raising awareness among reporters, among journalists, and then obviously taking legal action. But it seems that proving that kind of prioritization seems to be an enormous challenge. So though unjustly allocating resources. Martin Luther King said a budget is a moral document, right? A budget is a reflection of priorities. How do we get at that? It seems so squishy and such a challenge, and I'm just interested in hearing, because it's at the heart of so many of these conversations that we've been having.
And I think the national security context makes that all the more difficult because so much of it is secretive. And so it's really hard to do to get the data so you can do that kind of evaluation. And there are these persistent stereotypes. And obviously, Gisela can talk about the perpetual foreigner stereotype that has been used to target Asian Americans for a myriad, both national security and criminal justice and other select programs like the China Initiative, where, and that's the idea that because of a person's race or national origin, they can never be fully American. And, the Japanese internment was sort of the perfect example where, we were at war with Germany and Italy, and there were German nationals and Italian nationals who were incarcerated during that period, but they didn't go after German Americans or Italian Americans wholesale and put people not suspected of any kind of disloyalty in prison the way they did with Japanese Americans. Just highlight that issue in the national security context. And, one of the persistent rumors in the national security establishment is the 1,000 grains of sand theory. And, again, this is inherently racist, this idea but the idea is that Chinese espionage is at a level much higher. The Chinese government espionage is at a level much higher than any other national espionage, because they enlist the entire population as spies. And any person of Chinese American who comes, or of Chinese ancestry who comes to the United States, they aren't looking for national security secrets. All they need to do is pick up a grain of sand, some little piece of information that itself is not secret or dangerous to share. But once they get back to China, because there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people doing this, they can rebuild the beach in China and understand what secrets the U.S. government holds. And of course, it's a nonsensical but justifies this blanket suspicion over anyone of Chinese extraction. And Gisela, I don't know if you have more to comment on Jeremy's
No,
question.
I agree on what you mentioned, Mike, and to add another perspective to what Jeremy discussed in terms of priorities and the resources that the government was putting into this. When we think about both of that, we always think that there must be something unlawful, something so nefarious. And I think that's where the China Initiative cases were a bit different. For some time, the Al Capone comparison and his tax evasion had gained a bit of traction. Like, well, we couldn't catch the spies on the actual espionage activity, so we're getting them on these other things. But the problem was we weren't dealing with a bunch of Al Capones. We instead were dealing with normal professors who filled out a normal university form, where there's lots of questions whether that should even apply as a federal form. They filled it out. There are limits oftentimes to how long that page is, and they're supposed to fill everything in their life there. And then somehow the environment rapidly changed in terms of what's considered a conflict, what they should disclose. And suddenly the federal government was so creative in being able to say when you miss something there, that somehow you're committing a federal offense and could potentially spend years in prison. This was less a reflection of these individuals committing unlawful activities and more of a reflection of a rapidly changing research environment and a preference at the time for the federal government to use a heavy hand and a prosecution approach to deter activities, as opposed to having real, genuine discussions between the research and national security community on what's the best approach moving forward. And I think that's what we tried to emphasize, and that informed a lot of our decision making in how we advocated. Because, for example, we didn't use the term amnesty when we were pushing, because we were saying, well, that implies that there were actually something that they needed to be forgiven of. Because at times maybe there was a mistake, but oftentimes it wasn't even a mistake. But no one knows what actually should have been put in these forms appropriately at that time. And so that really, I think, kind of changes the discussion. And we thought that certainly that wasn't the right way for the government to use their resources. They needed to figure out in a much more collaborative approach how they were going to come to an agreement on how we will tackle risk management, how we will tackle academic integrity issues in a way where ultimately there are people that want American to compete on the same level, right? On a higher level than China, which is appropriate. But how do you do that properly, right? Without scapegoating a particular community in the U.S.
And I think a lot of it too has to do with this notion of national security. I know I keep going back to it, but it's such a nebulous concept, and because it's not well defined, the government looked at, okay, China is becoming an adversary, or at least the government started looking at the Chinese government as an adversary. So it's not just, are they taking dangerous secrets of our nuclear program or other secrets that our government needs to hold for national security purposes, but are they gaining an unfair advantage in the economic competition through the theft of intellectual property or trade secrets? And that shift started within the government to start looking at any knowledge going from the United States, particularly knowledge that was developed with the assistance of the federal government and the grant system, belonged to the United States. And therefore, any transfer of that knowledge to a foreign country, and particularly to China, was a theft, without recognizing that science doesn't work that way. And what was frustrating to me, only a few of us are old enough to have grown up during the Cold War, when we recognized the importance of spreading knowledge and having a free exchange of ideas in the scientific community, both to improve the United States and the lives of Americans, but also to improve the world and to forward scientific achievement, where here, normal science that isn't part of any national security, even if it's one of the things they do to sort of fuzz up what the distinction is, they call it dual use technology. This hammer isn't a national security threat, but boy, if a hammer can be used to build a nuclear device, then maybe it is a dual use device. So it creates this ambiguity of what it is we're actually targeting. And when you work in the national security community, It's like, okay, we have civil rights and individual privacy on this side of the balance, but we have the survival of the nation on the other. And it's very easy in that context to say the balance always weighs toward security, when in fact that balance doesn't exist. That if the only way I create security in the United States is by putting some Americans in peril and under suspicion, then you're not improving the overall national security. You're just scapegoating, as Gisela said, where, particularly when we're talking about science, the results of the China initiative, and this again was through some great research that was conducted, was to drive certainly a lot of Chinese scholars and Chinese nationals who were in the United States studying, but also other foreign scholars away from the U.S. institutions, so that they wouldn't get caught up in this dragnet. Can you talk about some of that, Gisela?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of push our data that was our AASF scientists had pulled together following the China initiative. We had surveyed over 1,300 scientists of Chinese descent. And what we had found was, in many ways, if people's goal was to deter the scientific community, they were successful. Our studies had shown that 42% were fearful of conducting research in the US, and 61% considered leaving the country. But despite all this, about 90% said that they still wanted to contribute to the US research enterprise. And so one of the things that we argued was, or I have been trying to push forward, is I think for so long we've been fed this false dichotomy. You either get national security or you get civil rights. And one of the things, at least in this case, we were arguing was, we're fortunate that both are actually in alignment. If we get talents, if we have a welcoming environment that pulls many of these scientists and researchers to stay here and contribute in the United States, that actually makes our national security stronger. And in many ways, racist bias policies are hurting us, that people are moving in a way that's counter to American interests. When we think even about the case of Dr. Gang Chen, his case was so weak, but was one of the most notable under the China initiative, and essentially fell apart pretty early on. But what I think is important to note is, after that, he and his team went on to find a new semiconducting material. Something that makes the US more competitive. And so that's the sort of talent, when we talk about one person, it's not, we can't just think of them as one individual. We have to think about all of the different discoveries and innovations that they could have that will stay here in the United States. And so we are really trying to think, in the national security debate, in terms of how the US can be competitive with China, we need to make sure the Asian Americans are not collateral damage in the middle of that debate. We need to find a way to continue to safeguard their rights while we're trying to tackle very difficult questions of, risk, research, security. But it continues to be really relevant right now. And I'll add this: we have scientists that are continuing to get stopped at the border. We have attempts to reinstate the China initiative almost every 6 months in Congress. And you have not only now the scientific community, but increasingly a lot of humanities professors who are also finding themselves being questioned by the government right now. And it's starting to look as if it's less so about your research and more so about any connections you have to China, including things that you cannot change because it's inherent to your identity or your family.
Jeremy? You're on mute.
Sorry, thank you, Gisela, and thanks, Mike. This idea of national security as muddying the waters, it's amazing to think that even further competitiveness, to muddy the waters in a way, economic competitiveness, utterly beyond any semblance of legality. But this sort of governance by campaign or governance by vibes or something like that might make somebody, might allow this to sort of pass by, unless people like you all are catching this. And I also just want to note another group, so that lawyers, law enforcement, and also journalism. Thanks, Jeff Mervis, for your question. I'm going to read it aloud, except for the identifying information at the end, which I'll share with Mike. Jeff asks, he says, I'm interested in the recent cases involving Chinese postdocs at University of Michigan alleged to have smuggled biological materials. It feels like CI 2.0.
China Initiative 2.0.
Oh, China Initiative 2.0. Only this time aimed at early career scientists with the goal of deporting them. Thoughts are welcome, and I'll share your contact there, Jeff, with Mike separately.
Actually, I'm not familiar with these cases. I don't know if Gisela, if you are.
I'm holding a comment on these cases right now, but
Okay. That's the difficulty of working for an advocacy group that actually represents the defendants. Obviously, their rights in their case are paramount when you have that kind of responsibility. But I will familiarize myself with those cases to learn more about it, and happy to be in touch if there's a way I can help. But this idea of using the criminal justice system as a mechanism to drive researchers away, I think many in the national security community, particularly who've been trained with this perpetual foreigner bias, would look at that as success. That, well, we're looking at the data that the Asian American Scholars Forum has put together about scholars being afraid to work here. That's a success. We want them to be afraid to work on these issues because that will reduce the amount of actual spies that are willing to do that, which is kind of a confused logic, right? I worked as an undercover agent, and if they were blaming somebody else for being an undercover agent, that actually helped me. It distracted attention away from the people who are actually doing something that the government should have an interest in focusing on, and misallocating resources rather than using the national security resources you have to focus on the people who are actually intending harm. So, again, in the long run, if we're dissuading researchers from coming to the United States, that overall is a greater harm. When we look at what are quote unquote national security threats, it's not just threats from hostile foreign states, but threats of climate change, threats of epidemic diseases like COVID, and those sorts of problems need to have a scientific solution. And if we're not collaborating around the world on addressing those problems, those can't be solved by one nation. So it's really, and that was a big part of our effort internally with the Justice Department and the national security establishment, was trying to reconfigure the way that these entities who had so much power to do harm, denying a visa, just the fact of being investigated. One of the tactics that's continued to be used even after the China Initiative was formally ended is law enforcement, FBI, and intelligence agents going to school administrators and saying, hey, we have some concerns about this one professor, and that would cause the university system to, in a error towards caution, say, okay, maybe we're not going to retain that person after their postdoc period is up, or we're not going to allow them to work on these certain issues that the government has concerns about. So it creates a broader chilling effect without any due process to establish whether that person is actually doing anything improper. So a big part of the problem, one of the things that I want to make sure we highlight, however, is is the effectiveness of organizing and the effectiveness of the kind of advocacy that we're part of. One of the things that I was very impressed with early on, and I want to give a shout out to Representative Judy Chu, that typically what you saw during the initial phases of an arrest and prosecution when somebody is labeled a terrorist or a spy is it's very difficult to get any support for that person. Nobody wants, that person becomes untouchable, that, oh, I don't want to leave, I don't know what the government knows. I don't know if this person is really somebody who's trying to do us harm. So I'll just reserve judgment and reserve any kind of support because I don't want to be connected to something so foul. Where, during the case of Professor Shi that we mentioned from Temple University, Representative Chu immediately came out in support of Professor Shi and Sherry Chen, another Ohio researcher who was unfairly targeted prior to the China initiative. And I think that kind of leadership is crucial. And obviously the groups that already existed, like Advancing Justice AAJC and the APA Justice Task Force were really effective in raising awareness and providing information to the community. And then the Asian American Scholars Forum formed. And why don't you tell us about that formation and how effective that has been in making sure that these issues are.
Yeah, in many ways, from the civil rights perspective, we like the way that the Asian American Scholar Forum came into existence because it was organic. It came from the community. It was scientists, researchers, and scholars coming together after Dr. Gang Chen was arrested from MIT. And, oftentimes, what moves and touches people is unpredictable. But there was something about Dr. Gang Chen's case, his personality, his family that was able to unite the scholar community together to actually create a nonprofit that can represent their interests long term. The goal fundamentally was that if they're going to be impacted by these policies, they need to have a seat at the table. Would there have been a China initiative if scientists and researchers were consulted? And I found it to be extremely effective, especially when thinking about how the science and technology platform is so much more complicated now that we need to consider how to safeguard civil rights and make sure that it's non-discriminatory. It's a very, very complicated process. And because the country is trying to move forward in figuring out how they're going to handle risk mitigation and research when it comes to anything related to China, that's very challenging. And you need to have people directly from the community in the room, but you also need them to be bridged with the legal community, with experts like Mike in law enforcement and policy, because fundamentally these are such challenging questions that no one expert can really come up with a solution. And we won't even come up with the solution the first time. One of the recommendations we often had with federal agencies after we spoke with them about the process is that you should commit to this being a pilot. Because once you test it out, we'll get a sense of the number of cases, how the scope of it, how people are going to get impacted, and then we need to be able to adjust it. Now, obviously, that was a time when there was more openness to working together on some of this, but fundamentally, you need to have the community involved when it comes to crafting solutions for them. And unfortunately, we need it now more than ever because there is such an increase in targeting for, I would say, not only Asian American researchers, but the whole research and scientific community have really found themselves a bit at the chopping block. A lot of strategies that were used against Chinese American scientists are now being used against research communities as a whole.
There's a lot of technology advancements And one of the things that I'm concerned about is the African countries are doing technology so far advanced than we are, and I think a lot of it has to do with like you said, laws and uh, racism and so on. My question is challenging the evidence, trade secrets versus technology. So, could you talk a little bit about that?
Um, did you want to tackle that, Mike, or?
Sure. When the U.S. government started looking at the theft of intellectual property, they were most concerned. The theft of intellectual property has been an issue around forever, right? But there was this supposition that, well, when a government is sponsoring it, it becomes much more dangerous, right? That it's the government has a lot of resources. Any government has tremendous resources. So if a government is having government agents go out and instead of trying to steal national security secrets, are trying to steal intellectual property from corporations and from individuals who are developing it, that's an unfair advantage that government then gets. So they started creating laws that were designed to give the government extra powers, give the federal government extra powers to address that nation state activity. But, unfortunately, it's often very hard to peel that away. And once you bring in that national security establishment, there's often a lot of pressure that, okay, we don't want to bring this case right now because we're involved in a trade negotiation with that country. So, highlighting that this government is doing something untoward when we're trying to get the Senate to agree on a trade agreement doesn't really work for us. So, in the area of national security, the government would come down to the FBI and say, no, we don't want you working that case. And so it sort of distorts what is the justice issue, which are we targeting this problem or are we unfairly targeting a particular country because we want to change whatever that country is doing? And, I think this is one of the underlying problems with China related issues is that there isn't a lot of information, and Jeremy, I hope you and your colleagues can be helpful in this to educate the American public about these issues. Certainly Chinese is a rising global power, or I'm sorry, China is a rising global power, and how we address that as a nation, I think, is very important. It's more important for us to understand how to work with them rather than to treat them as an adversary. And, I likened it to, you're running a race against a competitor who's challenging you and maybe better than you now. One way you can address that is by improving your training, improving your research about how you can run the race faster. The other way is by, cutting his Achilles heel. But cutting his Achilles heel doesn't make you any faster, doesn't make you any better. And it's only a matter of time before another competitor will come up and challenge you if you're not constantly improving yourself. And I think that's where this China initiative has been such a problem, because it's actually not making us better, and in many ways making us less educated on science and technology and less able to advance science and technology in those areas.
And that's where
I wanted to. Oh, sorry, Stan,
I'm
go
sorry,
on.
and that's where I was heading. That's what my question was heading to. Is this stuff that's going on is so negative to production? Has it held us back? I mean, how far has it held us back? Because we're dabbling in racism as opposed to technology.
Yeah.
No, absolutely, it is hindering us, and I think one of the things I wanted to flesh out on your earlier points, Stan, is In many ways, we're not even talking about trade secrets or confidential information. A lot of what people are debating are fundamental basic research that is publicly available to everyone. And what you're instead seeing is people are trying to decide how they want to treat that sort of research. Academics, national security experts, law enforcement, they all have different ideas of how to approach it. But I think what is really important to note is if we approach it a certain way in the US, if in a way where it's deterring our scientists, it doesn't only impact Asian American scientists or Chinese American scientists. These sort of policies are going to have a ripple effect on the whole research community because imagine that you are a US researcher and you are concerned about having any ties or connection with a Chinese researcher. What does that mean about your collaborations with researchers in Europe or researchers in Africa? How can you control who they're talking to and who they're collaborating with? So if we're closing the doors for ourselves, that has a lot of implications for our future. So, people have different ideas of how we can really win the technology race. But I think for us, at least at ASF, we firmly think that, it's about the talent pipeline and making sure that the United States remains an attractive place for people to want to go move to for these great talents to come and stay.
Great, Jeremy.
I wanted to, because Stan noted that it's Jackie Robinson Day, I just remember a Chris Rock quote about this. It's, I think, very relevant when he said, he talked about flipping the idea that Jackie Robinson was allowed to play in the major leagues. And he said the great players of the major league were then allowed to play with Jackie Robinson. Mm-hmm. And I think this idea of the way in which racism befouls so many landscapes and really makes us worse in every way is worth remembering on Jackie Robinson Day. And the way in which policies like these, misguided campaigns and priorities like these, make the world measurably worse. The facts are in, the science is in, the numbers are in. So I was reminded of that Chris Rock quote, and of course Stan's Brooklyn Dodgers shirt, and that it's Jackie Robinson Day. I thought that was a neat point, also building on Gisela's note about this robbing us of so many opportunities and so many potential breakthroughs, science, technology, but also in the humanities and other areas. But I also was jumping in because I don't want to keep our guests too much past the top of the hour. This has been so great, as always, to learn from you, Mike and Gisela. Stan, it's always a delight. And I'll turn it back to you for any closing thoughts.
Just to thank Gisela, not just for appearing again on the web cam, but for all your work and the work of the Asian American Scholars Forum.
Thank you, Gisela.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much.
Conversations on Race and Policing has been supported by funding from the California State University San Bernardino College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Faux Library, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Finn Lee is our technical consultant. Pamela Crossan provides administrative support, and Alan Yavor provides communication support. There's more information in the show notes, and please join us online at csusb.edu/CORP for upcoming programming and to find our catalog of over 100 past events with guests like Robin D.G. Kelly, Jamal Bona, Dorothy Roberts, and many more.